Okay, then, let's get started. Our first order of business is to hope for a volunteer for someone to take the minutes. And I know we've been, passing that baton around among committee members. Anybody want to volunteer to take the minutes today?
If I'm late, does that mean I get to take them?
If you're willing, Liz, we can
That's
call
fine.
it your turn. Thank you.
That's fine. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thanks very much. The second order of business is to approve the minutes from last meeting. Christine Donovan was the recorder, and I can report I think she did a great job and recommend that we approve the minutes as written. Any discussion about that? I'm going to take a minute to look at them. Other than the report, detailing the report that we got from New York, the substantive recommendation in the minutes was that CSM should ask the climate office to reach out to New York DEC to better understand what is meant by the invitation to be an observer, and to determine whether Vermont is going to choose to be an observer of the New York process. I don't know if we have a report back on that, but in any event, that was the action item that was mentioned in the minutes.
I can give a brief follow-up if that would be helpful.
Sure.
So I did inquire with Deputy Commissioner Binder following the last subcommittee meeting to answer that question, and he indicated that they didn't have any formal parameters for observer participation at this point, and instead offered that if we had an idea of what would best suit our needs in terms of better understanding their program, that we were welcome to propose that to them. So he kind of threw it back in our court. That was a few months ago now, because we had that conversation immediately following our last meeting, and we haven't met for quite some time. So I'd be happy to follow up with him again to understand if they have proceeded to interact differently with other jurisdictions since then, and so I'd be happy to follow up again, but that is the response that I received from New York.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I think that ultimately that's going to be a decision for the climate office or the administration generally. So the committee did decide in our last conversation that we wanted to follow up on that. So thanks for agreeing to do that, and maybe we'll hear back at the next meeting.
And just so you know, of course, we've been, or myself and others in the climate office have been keeping up with their process in New York, and following the development of the 3 regulatory actions that they plan to take. They plan to propose those rules at the end of the year, and then I believe move forward in their formal rulemaking process next year for program implementation in 2025. And of course, we've been following along with the public process that's been associated with that.
Okay, thanks very much. At some point, it might be appropriate to ask the climate office to brief us on what New York is doing, or to hear back from them again. Jared?
Not on this topic, but before we finalize and move forward with the minutes, I just want to make a request. and I can say this on my own behalf and then see if others who are in the same situation agree. But I see that the way that the notes were taken in terms of, there's a list of attendees of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, and when and where we have them, it lists organizational affiliations. I think it is more appropriate to list us as council members or members of the subcommittee. If additional detail is desired, it could be the seat that we were appointed to. But, I'll just say for me personally, when I am participating in these meetings, I am doing so as an appointed member of the Climate Council, not on behalf of EAN. So I don't think that those organizational affiliations in the notes represent the kind of way in which many people are participating, which is in their appointed council seats rather than on behalf of the organization that they may work for.
So, Jared, I'm going to take that as a recommendation to amend the minutes for that purpose. And
I think it's especially appropriate for the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee members. I mean, for the members, the attendees from the public, it may make sense to have those affiliations there. But for those of us who are participating in our council roles or in our appointed subcommittee roles, that seems the more appropriate affiliation to reference than the organizational affiliations.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further discussion on that point? All right, we'll ask that the minutes be amended to reflect the point just made by Jared. Any other comments about the minutes? Hearing none, I take it in our usual fashion that the minutes will be deemed to be accepted with the amendment just discussed.
Sorry, I apologize. I was eating, so I was off camera. It took me a second to get back on. There was another item in the discussion that I'm not sure that happened, but that the committee agreed to try and raise this topic for the full Climate Council. I'm going to suggest, we don't need to amend the minutes or anything, but that maybe we add to a discussion. I think we'll have time at the end of this meeting to have some next steps and maybe revisit that, whether the appropriate timing. I don't believe this came up at the September meeting of the full council. And just for folks who don't have it up, it just says that our committee will seek to ensure the topic of the New York Climate Act and the resulting program design and regulatory work is a formal part of the BCC meeting in September. And so, there may have been a brief update, but we should just keep that in mind as we talk about maybe the next couple of meetings here.
Agreed, TJ. I take that as we don't need to amend these minutes because that's what we discussed then. But we need to keep in mind that that's still an open question for the full council. All right. Thanks for the reminder.
Rich?
Yes, Gina.
I was present at the last meeting and my name is not on the list.
Okay.
Just noticed that.
I'll add it.
Thanks, Gina. This is the longest discussion of minutes that we've had in a long time. And all good.
This is making me regret my my volunteering.
We're sure your minutes will be just awesome. Yes. Okay, then. As I think we're at the end of approving the minutes. If there's no further comments. All right, thank you. Now on to today's agenda. The principal topic for today is an update from VTrans and the consultants concerning the carbon reduction strategy, its elements, and where we're headed with that. So I'm just going to turn it over to if there's someone who wants to provide an introduction to that topic from the administration, that'd be fine. And then turn it over to the presenters. Megan, was that you speaking?
No, that was Andrea.
Andrea, okay, yeah. So, I mean, normally we would just say, okay, Andrea, let's hear from you.
Okay. Everyone's seeing that, yeah?
Like the slides.
Yeah. So thanks for having us back. We're nearing the completion of our carbon reduction strategy, and we'll just kind of provide where we're at and sort of the summary of the whole thing. So Chris, you can go on to the next slide. This is our agenda for today. We're going to go real quickly through just an overview of the project. Gina, I promise it won't take long, but for the sake of people who haven't heard it before and for the recording, we'll spend a couple of minutes just going through sort of the background of why we're doing this work, and then turn it over to Cambridge Systematics to go over the analysis for the baseline and the gap analysis, and also what we did for an analysis and modeling for the different strategies. Go provide an overview of the public meeting and stakeholder outreach that we did for round 2 and what we heard from that, and then go into some detail about the recommendations of the strategy and provide some time at the end for discussion. Go ahead, Chris. Oh, just for introductions, I forgot to do that. I'm Andrea Wright, and I'm the Environmental Policy Manager at VTrans. I'm serving as the project champion for this work. And Chris, Ben, if you guys want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Chris Porter with Cambridge Systematics. I'm the project manager for the carbon reduction strategy.
And I'm Ben Eskin with Cambridge Systematics, assisting Chris and Andrew in the analysis.
Okay, thanks. So again, just really quickly, the work that we did had 2 primary objectives. The first, to support the requirements of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions as laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act, including that sectoral proportionality of the 40% for the transportation sector. And the second is to support the federal requirement for each DOT to develop a carbon reduction strategy that will describe how we will most cost effectively implement the carbon reduction program funds. VTrans is slated to receive $32 million, and that's between federal fiscal year 22 and 26. Next slide, Chris. We had 2 phases for this work. The first was to develop a methodology for evaluating the effect of the agency's capital program on greenhouse gas emissions, and then the second, to develop a strategy that would recommend different types of programs, projects, and policies that would close the gap towards the Global Warming Solution Act requirements. Next slide. So this is our timeline. It shows the tasks for both phases laid out. Also shows the touch points that we had with the technical and advisory committees, really working closely with the technical committee on the phase 1 methodology, and then along the way with the advisory committee, but more intently as we developed and evaluated the different strategies. It also shows the 2 rounds of public outreach and stakeholder meetings that we held. And right now, the timeline doesn't quite go to it, but right now we have a final draft from Cambridge Systematics that we're reviewing. I'm reviewing that right now. We will have our Vermont Federal Highway Office review that, as well as our executive staff. And then ultimately, our requirement is to submit the strategy to Federal Highway Headquarters by November 15th for their review and approval. Yep, go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Thanks. So, all right. So I'm just going to kind of go quickly through the baseline forecast and gap and strategy analysis. I believe we presented some preliminary information on some of this last spring. But we've done a lot of updating and revision of numbers, a lot of coordination with ANR to try to make sure we're being as consistent as possible with the modeling assumptions for the climate action plan. Although there are some differences in methods and underlying data that we couldn't fully resolve, so there will be some differences in our numbers. But just in terms of some of the key parameters, we are forecasting modest to moderate increases in vehicle miles traveled. That's consistent with the climate action plan forecasts. And also, for trucks as well as for cars, as well as a very high level of increase of zero emission vehicles, especially on the light duty side, but also on the medium and heavy truck side, assuming the advanced clean cars 2 and the advanced clean trucks rules as baselines for our analysis. So the baseline forecast shows emissions from on-road vehicles declining from about 2.6 million metric tons today to 2.1 in 2030 and about 500,000 in 2050. And then there's some contributions, much smaller contributions from the other modes, mostly for rail, for aviation, for marine. We really took those from the climate action plan analysis. And in this case, we don't have policies built in the baseline that are showing substantial reductions. So those are, kind of projected to hold roughly constant and be an increasing fraction of the emissions in the future. You can see the target emissions being about 2 million metric tons in 2030 for the transportation sector, given the kind of the 40% proportional share. And that leaves a gap of about 400,000 metric tons, with a gap of about 100,000 metric tons in 2050. Again, those numbers differ somewhat from ANR's numbers, but ANR for the climate action plan is also showing a fairly substantial gap in emissions. And this is just a visual of the projected baseline emissions versus the targets. We did a little bit of sensitivity analysis for some of the key parameters in the baseline. If we assume a higher population growth, 30% higher growth rate, which is on top of a fairly small growth rate, so it doesn't have a huge impact, but that does increase the gap a little bit, as you would expect. If EV adoption proceeds slower than anticipated under the rules, then yes, of course, the gap will get bigger. On the other hand, if people drive less, if we saw about 5% less driving during the peak of the pandemic, and that could bring that gap down if people sort of revert to those trends, in terms of doing less physical travel. In terms of the reduction strategies, I think we indicated last time that we were looking at sort of a portfolio of what we felt were aggressive but still doable expansion of some of these strategies compared to what is currently in the Agency of Transportation's portfolio, with bicycle and pedestrian projects, transit service, micromobility incentives, demand management, transit vehicle electrification, and then some things that are outside, that are sort of broader issues such as land use, broadband expansion, potentially adopting the advanced clean fleet rule to further the acceleration of zero emission trucks, which would have a bigger impact. And then potentially, we're not necessarily recommending this at this point, but I'll get into recommendations later, but looking at potential fee baits, which is charging a fee for higher emitting vehicles and using that money to give rebates for lower emissions vehicles. And the combined effects of all those strategies in 2030, well, just from the transportation investments, only closes the gap by a couple of percent, maybe a few more percent with land use and broadband, and then maybe 15 to 20% with the advanced clean fleets and the fee baits. And then we do have estimated costs as well. I do want to point out that you don't want to just take a cost number, divide it by the tons of emission reduced and get a cost effectiveness, because a lot of these strategies have other benefits that are really important, like mobility benefits, safety benefits. So these are sort of multi-pronged strategies. And we also model out to 2050. In that case, there's a couple of strategies that stand out as closing more of the gap. Transit vehicle electrification has a relatively bigger impact. The gap is smaller, remember, so and then advanced clean fleets also has a actually potentially would close the gap altogether if the targets were if the regulations were achieved in practice. And so, so just with these strategies, yeah, it does seem like the 2050 gap could be closed, although not the 2030 gap. Before I jump into the second round of stakeholder outreach, and the recommendations, I wanted to see if there were any clarifying questions on any of the emissions data we've presented so far. Jared.
Chris, I just want to thank you and your team for updating the sectoral proportionality in line with the 2018 reference year for the responsibility of each sector. Just for folks who don't know, in the initial draft, the kind of way that sectoral proportionality was originally assumed was different than the way that the council had decided to address that topic when we were developing the initial climate action plan. So I just want to say I'm pleased to see that those target emissions in the key compliance years now reflect the approach to sectoral proportionality that the council agreed upon. So thank you for that.
Great, yeah, thanks for pointing that out for us. TJ?
Sorry, I just wanted to confirm what I thought I heard is, well, in this slide, actually going back to it raises another question. So by this, it looks like the baseline says we're going to meet our 2025 target. And then in 2030, what I thought I heard is that you say all of the measures analyzed, we're not going to meet our 2030 target, even with all of those programs analyzed. Is that?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just one.
Thank you for pointing out, yes, the 2025 target does seem like it's on track to be met, but there's not much we can do between now and 2025 to change direction. So
just want to offer one friendly amendment. I think an important clarification that when what I understand, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, is that when you're talking about meeting the requirements in 2025, that is just for the transportation sector's proportional requirement, not for the overall economy-wide or statewide emissions requirement, because that would require analysis of all other emitting sectors that was not done.
That's exactly right. We're only looking at the transportation sector, so I can't speak to the other sectors. Gina?
Yeah, is there any way you can put a percentage on the uncertainty over time? So 2025 has a certain degree of uncertainty, 2030, and then 2050. Because right now it looks like they're all kind of equal in terms of their certainty.
I mean, I would say the farther out you go, the greater the uncertainty.
Yeah, well, that's what I assumed. But you can't say, you can't say to what degree. No.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could do some sort of exercise where you tried to come up with uncertain error bars for each underlying factor, but I'm not sure it wouldn't be very precise.
Okay, so take it with a grain of salt.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other hands up. So moving into the second round of stakeholder outreach. So like we did a first round in March, just to introduce the topic, and the second round really actually presented preliminary findings. We had virtual public meetings at the beginning of August. We had, again, we repeated, well, 5 focus groups and an online survey with about 700 respondents. And then we got about almost 70 comments via the website. So just what some of the themes that we heard from the different groups, from businesses, there was some interest in looking at sustainable fuels, not just electrification. Some acknowledgement that the legislature, if land uses reform is needed, but it's really something the legislature really needs to take on. Questions about sustainability of funding that's needed for investments. And then sort of looking at support for tourism and economic development. And, you know, I think from the freight and rail stakeholders, we heard most loudly, they were concerned about zero emission vehicle technology just not being available or affordable, at least at this point, and some challenges with electrification. For the public transportation providers, regional planning agencies, and environmental interests, a lot of common themes, interest in looking expansively at transit, not just fixed route services, but services that can really serve lower density, smaller communities that we have in Vermont. You know, focusing on demand management, not highway expansion. Really considering some of these higher impact, more controversial policies that I actually haven't talked about yet, but we'll talk about, like cap and trade and low carbon fuels. You know, some other issues that came up having to do with wanting more flexibility related to road design in town and village centers to support land use, and some of the effects of electric vehicles. And then we also spoke with some community or representatives of community groups with an equity focus, and, you know, some specific concerns potentially related to cap and trade, the importance of transit, bicycle pedestrian investment, and also just sort of outreach, just the fact that there's so much outreach now, people are a little bit overwhelmed, and we want to coordinate. We know what they need, and we just kind of need to do it. The public survey, we asked about levels of interest in these different strategies, and sidewalk and bike infrastructure and came out on top, with transit and land use being next. But most of the strategies had quite a bit of interest. You know, some of the you know, the clean transportation, advanced clean fleets, cap and invest were a little bit lower. But yeah, overall, a lot of interest in all of the strategies. And then we asked, because we had a kind of a program of proposed and hypothetical investments that we modeled, and we presented some information on what that would mean, how much it would cost, and what the benefits would be, and then asked, you know, whether they thought we should do more or less of this. And, you know, in most cases, yeah, people thought we should do about the same or more, certainly more bicycle and pedestrian. I'll get back to some of the concerns and considerations later as we get into the recommendations. But I just wanted to quickly flip through and show some of the public results. Transit, you know, again, a lot of support for expanding or maintaining. Same thing with electric vehicles. And land use is also very popular in terms of doing more on that. And then finally, cap and invest, a little bit more uncertainty about this. You know, I think there's a little bit less understanding about what this would mean, how it would work, and what this would mean. So as we get into the strategy document, this is just an outline, basically kind of what we're going through today in terms of the process, the evaluation of strategies, recommendations, and then a bunch of supporting material in the appendices. So getting into really kind of the meat of things, we bucketed the recommendations into 6 categories. The first is expanding transportation capital program investment and services, something really under the VTrans purview, but with the constraint that funding is needed. And I'm going to get into each one of these a little bit more detail. The second one is, you know, focusing on compact land use and teletravel through programs and incentives. The third is really supporting maximum conversion of the vehicle fleet to zero emission vehicles and supporting those rules that are already on the books in addition to anything to go beyond them. The fourth is undertaking a process with public and stakeholder involvement to really further evaluate, develop, and implement additional programs that we need to close the remaining gap. And realize that we couldn't solve every problem. We couldn't quite solve everything in this effort, but we sort of laid the foundation for those. But also this kind of more work is needed on that. The fifth is sort of a cross-cutting recommendation just to center equity in everything that we do, and we do try to do that in a lot of the recommendations. And the sixth one, also another cross-cutting one, is to measure and report on progress in ways that can support and further, decision making and sort of refinement as we go along. So for the capital program, in the strategy document, we start off by listing current activities as a baseline, and then the recommendations for improvement or additional recommendations. And then we talk about considerations that came up in the public and stakeholder outreach and other things that really need to be thought about. So definitely already some investment in carbon reducing projects and services, recommendations, and expanding those. And then in the considerations, there's definitely, again, a need for a sustainable funding source. There's a need for services supporting rural and small communities, considerations of seasonality of some of these, bicycle and pedestrian use, and just not necessarily year round. And then also coordinating investments with transit, with good land use. On the land use and teletravel side, current activities related to tax credits and sales tax reallocations and broadband, potential opportunities to expand those, additional smart growth zoning incentives. There's definitely, I know that there's things going on in the legislature with conversations about possible Act 250 reform, zoning and subdivision reform to make it easier to develop in town and village centers. And then on the VTrans side, working on multimodal highway guidance that will, support multimodal travel on state roads in those centers as well. Some considerations that were raised, just, always have to be a little careful in land use about, what people can and can't do with their property. A lot of recognition of the need for affordable housing, not just more housing, but affordable housing in the right places. And then again, the transportation standards. Also, just sort of some of the uncertain impacts of teletravel. Excuse me a minute. All right. On the zero emission vehicle side, again, current rulemakings, recently adopted some electric vehicle incentives, federal money that's out there, utility money, but potentially additional opportunities to really build out a robust public charging network, and provide additional incentives, especially looking at kind of lower income households and things like, what do you need to do to upgrade to put a charger in at your house, if you've got an old electrical system. Also some interest in looking at potential incentives for super users or people who drive a lot. And then but really some considerations that we heard on this affordability, and again, the need for really income targeted incentives, the availability, of some of the technologies that's not there yet or hard to get because of supply chain issues. And then also some concerns related to life cycle emissions, especially associated with electric vehicle battery production, some of the upstream, all the mining, sort of what's the payback, before you really get net benefits from that. So the additional strategies, bumped ahead. So we recommended 4 additional strategies for kind of a further evaluation and development. As I mentioned, the Advanced Clean Fleets Rule, the Clean Transportation Standard, and Cap and Invest which in the climate action plan, I know recommended both of those as really the only two strategies that really could close the gap fully. And so those, the state may need to do one or both of those to actually close the gap. And then possibly fee-based as another strategy, especially if we can't kind of do one of some of the others for some reason. But definitely here's some considerations related to the potential impact on the economic and business climate, and really need to be careful in the program design, working regionally so that it's not just Vermont, looking at ways of mitigating negative impacts on households and certain industries. So we get into some of the program design considerations for each of these. For advanced clean fleets, it's a little bit simpler because it's really basically following the California rulemaking. But there is, I think, in terms of doing due diligence, we really need to do a little bit of homework on the implications for Vermont in particular. How many fleets and vehicles would be covered? Are there concerns that fleet owners have about the rule? What happens if Vermont adopts it, but neighboring states don't? Could there be unintended consequences? And what does the state really need to do to actually make this rule, feasible and practical for fleet owners to follow? And the Clean Transportation Standard, a lot of, this is something that the West Coast states, California, Washington, I think British Columbia, maybe can't remember if Oregon's on this yet, but they are, there has been an active low carbon fuel standard in California for many years now. So there's a lot of opportunity to learn from those programs. But a lot of issues that sort of come up in the design, which fuels are going to cover, what mechanisms to generate credits, how fast does the carbon intensity standard decline, what do you use for life cycle factors for carbon intensity, and various considerations to really limit instability, manage the prices, and help support compliance. So that's on the plus side, this is a program that you can design it with a cap that really is consistent with the state's targets. It can be self-funding. You can cover administrative costs through the credit market transactions. There's been some research in California showing that so far it's not been a major driver of fuel prices. There was a study looking at the 2015 to 2019 period and found sort of an impact of up to 20 cents per gallon between the low carbon standard and a couple of other factors that they couldn't really pull apart. So, not a major impact yet. And in fact, some renewables do provide cost savings and could potentially in the long term help hedge against oil price and supply instability. And on the cap and invest, I think a lot of similar considerations with program design, and that's, again, New York is deep in the throes of designing this, a program for themselves, as you know, in addition to California's had one for quite a while. Washington State just started one. Quebec and California are linked. But, things like, what rate of cap do you put, how do you reserve allowances for certain industries that are really more sort of exposed to the effects and could move out of state? Again, considerations such as, banking, price caps, price floors to sort of help stabilize the market and support compliance. Can people use offsets? How the revenues get distributed? And again, some research in California. I mean, right now, the auction prices probably add 25 to 30 cents per gallon of gasoline, which is not huge, but it's also not trivial. And, on the flip side, those revenues are going back into programs that benefit consumers in different ways. And then finally, let's see, I'm getting low on time here, so I'm just kind of kind of skim through this, but a lot of issues in fee baits in terms of the design that we looked at a few years ago in a report for the legislature. So that's something that would also, if it were to be addressed, would need to be just kind of fleshed out a little bit more. I mentioned the additional recommendations. I just did want to point out that VTrans just adopted a transportation equity framework report. And so they are moving forward on, improving consideration of equity, and that will include the carbon reduction actions. And there are ways that you can design the services and the incentives to sort of help focus on the people who need it most. We talked about implementation a little bit, just the fact that, all of these need buy-in from the legislature. A lot of them need support from other state agencies, as well as municipalities and RPCs. So it's not just the Agency of Transportation. So this is some new material. We did look at the carbon reduction program in particular at the federal level. There are requirements for how that funding is distributed by urbanized area size. So a little over 10% of it goes to the Burlington and the Chittenden County MPO. The rest of it, is used in other places or throughout the state. And we had some discussion with VTrans. They are proposing to target their funds to 3 different buckets, basically bicycle and pedestrian projects, transit and micromobility, and then fleet conversion, including transit and heavy equipment, and about 1/3 each. Just based on a combination of co-benefits on what has popular stakeholder and public support, achieves other benefits, and is cost effective, and aligns with the climate action plan and the long range transportation plan priorities, and also has immediate needs. So they've got about 30 million, VTrans has about $30 million over the next 5 years through 2026. Not a huge amount of money, but it is something to help move the needle a little bit. And a couple of other things that the agency is planning to do. One is, again, the next long range plan update, to really bring carbon reduction more specifically and concretely into that. And then also to look at their project scoring criteria to really more explicitly consider greenhouse gas emissions. So that is the end of the presentation, and happy to take questions and comments and discussion.
Okay, then. I can't see everybody. So if your hand is up and I don't call on you, just let me know, because we've got the slide still up. Well, I'll start with a question about the agency's own operations, and the issue that comes to mind would be, have you considered, or was it part of your analysis to consider using lower emitting materials such as concrete, lower emitting concrete, or alternatives to higher emitting steel, let's say, or other aspects of internal operations as part of the carbon reduction program?
Yeah, great question. I sort of glossed over that. We did look at a high level estimate of emissions from construction and maintenance, especially and including materials and vehicles. And it's fairly small. It's less than 1% of the total transportation, but it's still something that VTrans can address and lead by example. And so we do have in the recommendations to look at research, which I think they're already doing some research on, but look at potentially adopting low carbon material specifications, to help reduce the embodied emissions associated with the maintenance and construction activities.
Thank you. And I looked at very briefly at the electrification of transit vehicles line. And did I see that that becomes a bigger thing towards 2050? Or is it just a small number across the board?
I think it's a small number. I mean, you're essentially, let's see. Yeah, so we had the number about 4,200 metric tons in 2030, and then about 17,000 in 2050. That's essentially the entirety of the emissions from those vehicles being zeroed out. And Ben, if you have anything to add in terms of comments on that, you can.
Yeah, that about covers it exactly. The modeled strategy was full electrification of the fleet by 2050. So the 17,000 would pretty much be that transition to all electric. And it just looks like a bigger piece of the gap in 2050, only because the gap is smaller in 2050. So it's just a quirk of the math there.
Thank you. And
Jared?
Jared, go ahead. I'll come back.
Thanks, Rich, and thank you, Chris and Ben and everybody who worked on this. One thing I just wanted to pause on, because I just want to propose a friendly amendment to the way that I think something was communicated. It may have been just around timing, but Chris, if you can go to the slide that talks about the analysis of cap and invest or cap and trade programs, there was a takeaway there that I just want to pause because I think there's a really important nuance. Yeah, so that third arrow on potential impacts on, it says increasing fuel prices. And, you know, I've looked very carefully at Oregon's clean fuel program, looked at what California's done with their low carbon fuel standard program. And I think it's important that say gasoline and diesel prices, because the effect works in the opposite direction for cleaner fuels. So what we've seen in those programs is that fuels like B100 biodiesel or other qualifying cleaner fuels are being reduced in price. So it's the polluting fuels that are seeing an upward price effect. It is the cleaner fuels that are seeing downward price effects. And I think it can just be misleading if we talk about all fuel prices increasing, because we're seeing upward and downward effects depending on the carbon intensity or the pollution or lack thereof from the fuel. We've also seen, I know in Oregon's program, reduced cost for things like installing EV infrastructure and sometimes credits for electrification. So I just think that that's a really important thing to pause and clarify, that there are price effects in both directions, and whether it's upward price pressure or downward price pressure depends on the carbon intensity and whether that fuel is going to increase pollution or decrease pollution.
Yeah, that's a great point, and we can definitely should include that clarification.
EJ.
Yeah, this may not be so much a question for you, Chris, but a question for the committee. And I keep kind of going back to what I clarified earlier, is that even with cap and invest or any of these other policies, that we're not meeting our proportional transportation requirements in 2030. And so if that's correct, which I see Jared shaking his head no, so that
no, that
yeah, so that's good. That's why I'm raising it. I guess I didn't understand.
I'm happy to share my interpretation, and then Chris, maybe you can tell us which one is right, or they're both wrong, and you see it differently. But when you shared that graph, it was saying that if we did all of these things that were studied, it was looking at bike ped, it was looking at land use, it was looking at advanced clean fleets, it was looking at a fee-bait. If you did all of those, it would only close 14% of the remaining gap that we need to close to comply with our legal obligations for 2030. And that in order to close that remaining 80 to 85% of emissions reductions that are required by 2030, the only known programs that could give us confidence we could do that are the ones that work under a cap or set a requirement, which are cap and invest, cap and trade, or a performance standard like a clean transportation standard. Those were not part of the analysis in terms of that remaining gap. Those I think were set aside as things that could close the gap.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that, Jared. And yeah, I should mention we didn't show those as what's the gap, what benefit could you get from these programs, because really the question with those programs is what level do you set, and you'd presumably set a cap level to achieve your requirement, and then the questions would be, well, what are the impacts going to be in terms of cost, in terms of other, how do you get there in terms of the program design? So it's kind of looking backwards, but yeah, in theory, those two programs would be set so that you would achieve your requirement.
Okay, so that is helpful. Thank you for clarifying that. And so did and the impacts of the cap, both positive and negative, right? That any or net benefits, net costs, however you want to frame it, that just the overall impacts specifically were fully analyzed. I didn't see kind of the both sides of the equation here. I saw you had the costs and then you mentioned other benefits, but is that right?
Well, the benefits would be in terms of emission reduction, and as well as any sort of co-benefits that you get depending on how, like the cap and invest, how you invest those, the auction proceeds. The costs would be, you've got some administrative costs for the program, as well as, there would be effects, some people would be benefit and some people would have to, end up paying more. Which is, how the program works. But, we haven't, to really do a detailed assessment of that, you'd have to get into much more details of the program design. So we have more of a qualitative assessment of what those potential benefits and impacts would be, as opposed to a quantitative evaluation.
All right. So yeah, so you have the costs of, what impacts to prices may be from a cap, but you don't really kind of get into the benefits of the programs from the revenue generated from that, and kind of, or the benefits and how that money is kind of spent.
Yeah, well, we do have, I think we do provide a little bit of information on the California programs and the revenue that's generating from their cap and invest, and if you scale that proportionally to Vermont, you could sort of get a ballpark. I don't remember what the number is, but yeah, that's sort of the best you could do. Just sort of a quick analysis, just look at what's happened in California.
Yeah. So two other questions, then, and then I'll let others go. Is in your estimation, is California representative of what you might see in Vermont, given the vastly different scale? And then two is, if we were establishing this, then, when the revenue comes back into programs that provide the benefits, like when would that, it's kind of a timing question of like, would those programs be in place in time to kind of really start to help people by the 2030 goals?
Yeah, there's definitely a lag time for all of this. I think, in terms of the California translating to Vermont, Quebec is certainly, a neighbor. So in some ways, maybe a little bit more. Vermont is still, unique in many ways, but, one of our recommendations is that Vermont tag on to another program, because the bigger the market, and that's both, the size of the market, the sectors that are covered, and, the more opportunities there are for finding the most efficient places to reduce emissions. And so, it certainly, who knows? I mean, I don't know whether New York's going to have their own program, if they're going to end up, kind of tying in with one of these other markets, but certainly linking up with neighbors, and then I think, once you do that, then you sort of have more confidence in sort of seeing similar effects. But all right, now I've forgotten your second question already.
So the second one was just the timing and kind of the lag you might see.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if New York is looking at possibly implementing it as by 2025, I imagine Vermont would be, a year or two behind that at best. And then, yeah, you've got, when it comes to in investments, yeah, it takes some time to get those cycled and circulating. And, I certainly think you'd be seeing some effects by 2030. But also, I mean, if you
lost you, I think, or maybe it was just me.
As well, in terms of looking up for more, bringing in more renewable fuels into the mix, and so I think having the more degree of certainty you can have sort of early on in terms of what you're doing, and give industry a chance to position themselves for that, will help sort of the benefits occur earlier.
Okay. Thanks for those clarifications.
Okay, Gina, and then Joey.
Yeah, I first want to say I really thank Andrea and the team here for this work, because this is an incredibly important basis for the Climate Council moving forward on transportation. It's putting everything together that we know right now, and what VTrans can and cannot do. That's so important to our work. The question I have, and maybe it's a question for the whole cross-sector mitigation team, but while we have Chris here, what do we do next? We have recommendations that they're the same recommendations that we had over a year ago, that we look at cap and trade and a fuel standard. We need, as the discussion just showed us, we need a deeper dive into what we do. So how would you tailor a scope of work for the next set of consultants we have in here to help us figure out whether we go with New York, we go with California? How will the program be structured? Is that something you can venture to assist us with, or is that way beyond what VTrans has asked you to do? Anyway, the cross-sector mitigation team has to have a discussion about this, and then it would be really good to hear from you, if possible, and I guess that's up to Andrea as well. How much can you help us moving forward on those policies that we had identified before and now have been reaffirmed as important to getting to the mandated goals?
Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, it's outside our immediate scope for this carbon reduction strategy, but I will defer to Andrea as to whether there is additional support that could be provided. Certainly, scoping sort of ongoing work program for this really does seem like the next step. I also, the beginning of the meeting, there was some reference to New York DEC sort of inviting you to be an observer. I assume that you're talking about those processes, including the cap and invest. But I mean, that seems like that'd be really valuable for you all to be part of that.
Yeah, Gina, I'll just add to it. Oh, well, I don't know how much I'll add to it, because I think you just said it. It sort of now lies in the hands or the scope of the cross-sector mitigation team, the transportation task group, to come up with moving forward on this or not, right? It's going to be something that the Climate Council moves forward with. And it's not something that we're going to use carbon reduction program funds for. That's not within the scope of those eligibilities and the guidelines, so that's not going to happen. But I think it's the discussion that needs to happen in this subcommittee.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gina. I'll take that as a recommendation that we included in our discussion. Joey?
Yeah, just sort of picking up on what Gina was just saying with first expressing gratitude for the work that you all have done as a team on this. I think there's a lot of like high level detailed information, and then the feedback from the public extremely useful. So a ton to build on. I do want to just echo Gina's interest in like gathering as much specific recommendations from you all as possible, because I feel like the questions, what we had gelled around in terms of our transportation addendum, recognizing that we're going to need one or more of some combination of cap and invest or performance standard, that ideally that this would have informed with a little bit more detail what directionally we should be doing there. And I know that, I know that ultimately the scope of work, I think, was to come up with, in part, an investment strategy to meet the Global Warming Solutions Act. So I'm just curious if you can, in your summation, you just made one recommendation that, Chris, I'd love to see in there, which is a recommendation is for the state agency staff, relevant staff at Agency of Natural Resources or VTrans to participate in regional stakeholder conversations like the New York Cap and Invest program. I think that to the degree we can benefit from as much insight that you all have based on this deep dive to set the stage for the next steps. I know that, legislators through the T-bill, we're looking at, this process to not only understand how we maximize existing revenue, but what are the sort of funding and financing gaps, or what are the recommended policy or regulatory approaches. I know, and I think what you've affirmed is that it's highly likely that the state's going to need to do one or more of cap and invest or a performance standard. So I just would ask to bear the benefit of all of your good thinking and analysis and research, both in service of Vermont, but both what you know about Vermont from your deep dive, but also more collaboratively and regionally, specific concrete next steps to help us move off of where we're at now to where we need to go.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that comment. And we'll see, how we can be as specific as possible in the recommendations.
I guess just really quickly, yeah, never mind. I will ask it at another point. Thanks, Chris.
Well, I might ask it. I'll just jump in here to follow up on Joey's question. Is I did not hear you recommending or forming a conclusion as to whether a low carbon fuel standard or a cap and invest strategy, which one would, at one point you said either or both. You have not formed a conclusion as to which one would be better if we were only doing one. Is that correct? And what Gina and Joey have put to you is the question whether we have it right that we are going to have a big gap if we don't do one or the other. And are you presently engaged to help us figure out next steps?
Yeah, and that's a great question on the either or both. I mean, what we've heard from California and the West Coast states is that they look at them as complementary programs. And that if you just do one, like if you just do the cap and invest, you're not going to hit everything that's needed in the transportation sector. For example, if it's a multi-sector program, and so if it turns out just to be cheaper to make the investments in the utility sector with industries, buildings, whatever, and then if transportation is sort of the last, then maybe you're not going to get as far as you want to be, and so that's where the low carbon fuel standard comes in terms of pushing that over the edge. But they're definitely seeing them as complementary programs, and you want to ideally have both. I don't know if it's a question of one or the other. I don't know what the best answer is there.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Jared, I jumped in there ahead of you. You're up.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, again, so much good information in this report, but you know, it also brings home for me that we're kind of, in a way, back to where we started. It really underlines for me the recommendation that we passed in the addendum to the climate action plan before, which is the only known ways to ensure that we meet an emissions reduction obligation are these programs that set caps or requirements for emissions reduction, either caps or performance standards. And you know, I think that your research just underlines that again, that basically adding up every possible thing aside from those gets us 14% of the way to closing the needed gap between our legal obligations, our science-based legal obligations for 2030, and what we might be on track to do. So I think that where that leaves us is we have to ask the question, how do we then advance the recommendation that is in our addendum, identifying those two opportunities with more detail. And it seems to me that at this point, there are a couple of pathways forward. One is New York, and being an observer to that process and trying to identify when and how and under what circumstances we would seek to link to that market and program. The other would be the Western Climate Initiative and participating with Quebec and California. And I just read a news article earlier this week that Washington State is looking at potentially joining that program as well. And you know, there is, and I totally agree with your characterization, Chris, that these programs are really not kind of mutually exclusive or meant to be kind of one or the other. That the evidence from the Western states shows that the complementary nature of doing cap and invest and fuel-based performance standards, you know, that it's best to advance them simultaneously. The one thing I do want to pause on is that I think often we have thought, because there has been such an identified gap in the climate action plan, in the modeling for meeting the requirements for 2030 in the transportation sector, kind of sometimes it ends up being talked about as though we need a plan for transportation emissions and like a transportation cap and focused cap and invest program. I want to be clear that from my perspective, from the interest of efficiency, of cost effectiveness, and of ensuring that we meet our legal obligations. Again, the Global Warming Solutions Act requires us to put forward as a council a plan that ensures, and ANR rules that ensure that we meet these requirements, not have a chance to meet them. That ensuring that we do that, to me, argues for an economy-wide cap and invest structure rather than a sector specific, which I think would end up being the same amount of work to design and stand up and implement, but as if we did it just to cover transportation sector versus economy-wide, but we would get more benefits, again, from efficiency, cost effectiveness, and ensuring that we're meeting the reductions. So my argument at this point would be, if we're going to go through the process of exploring joining, which I think we must, either New York's program or California and Quebec and potentially Washington's program, let's look at that not just from a transportation perspective, but from an economy-wide perspective.
Thanks, Jerry. Graham?
In terms of process, wondering if the transportation working group shouldn't bring forward a recommendation to cross-sector at our next cross-sector meeting, which if cross-sector as a subcommittee approves, can then be brought to the council for its consideration.
Thanks, Brent. Brian?
Thanks, Rich. I just wanted to go back to the modeling results that Chris gave, and I had the pleasure of working with Chris and Ben on trying to reconcile the A&R work that we've been doing with SEI with their work. And I think both the analysis are good, but they come to slightly different conclusions. And particularly in the transportation sector, but also overall, I think it's really important to say, or to not say that the modeling says that we are or not going to make the 2025 targets. I think it's fair to say that we just don't know, and the modeling diverges. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. The models are helpful in guidance, but they're not going to tell us exactly what's going to happen. And I think it's a good point to keep in mind that we are uncertain. And if for some reason, if it turns out that we don't meet that 2025 target, and we learn that later, that kind of changes the policy conversation. So just wanted to make that clear to everybody. And you will see different numbers from the updated baseline when we release them, accompanying the building's thermal report.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Joey, you're up.
So just to Bram's recommended next steps, I mean, I think it's a good idea. That I guess one of the reasons I'm just hoping to lean as heavily into the learning and expertise of the team who dug in so deeply is because I'm really not sure exactly, unless you can point me to, or it's going to be in the final report, like what would inform what that recommended next step looks like, or what, because I'm not sure exactly what the next steps. I don't know what we would recommend, Bram, because I'm not sure. I just feel like I want to have as much information from the consultants team who dug so deeply into this to inform that conversation. So that's why I keep asking for like as much meat on the bones as you can provide would be super helpful to me.
Thanks, Joey. Before we get an answer on that or continue the conversation, I'm noting that the public agenda says we would ask if there are any public comments at this point. I'd like to just open it up for a minute to see, are there members of the public present who would like to make a statement, present something to the committee? All right, hearing none, I'll go ahead with a couple of questions that I guess I'd like to see the numbers again, but I'll ask the question first. It seemed to me that the long-term emission reductions associated with smart growth and land use are pretty small in the transportation sector. And I know that there are many public policy reasons in Vermont to support smart growth and land use reforms. But I'm coming away from your presentation with the notion that as far as reducing emissions from transportation, it's relatively small savings associated with the way you've modeled smart growth and land use.
Yeah, so let me just make one observation, which is that when we're looking at 2050, because we are already starting with such a high electrification baseline, the impacts of any strategy that reduces travel is going to be relatively small in terms of the emissions numbers. And that's one reason why the electrification strategies look relatively so much bigger in 2050, is because that baseline is so much smaller. Now, yeah, in the long run, we do view land use as one of the more effective strategies for reducing emissions. It needs to, it's something that's maybe more effective in high growth areas than low growth areas, where you have more opportunity to shape development. And low growth, it's an area like Vermont, it's much more incremental. So I think those are the two reasons why I think it came out to be so small in our analysis.
Right, but you're showing this as one of the one of the lowest numbers in the analysis, less than 1% of the 2050 gap. I'm not trying to make a big point here. I'm just trying to remind us that if we're going to focus on the largest impact strategies, they lie elsewhere.
The one other note that I'll just chime in with respect to kind of how land use is modeled is, as Chris said, again, in 2050, it's small only in part because if most passenger cars are fully electric on zero emission, then again, anything that substitutes travel is going to be low. And in 2030, it's just such a short time horizon in 6 years that the kind of level of population growth and housing turnover that we can even see in the next 6 years is just limited by those realities of how much land use change can happen in that 6 years. So in reality, like, you actually might see reasonable amounts of carbon reduction kind of almost between 2030 and 2050 as those forces still kind of, population continues to grow and the light duty fleet continues to change, but it is sort of bound by those two forces again of a rapidly electrifying fleet and how quickly new developments can happen or housing stock can turn over. But yeah, a lot of literature does show again that it does have long-term potential. It's just kind of working within those parameters.
Okay, thank you. And one thing that was missing from all of this, and I don't know if you looked at it at all, but in some states there has been discussion of adding to the incentives for electric vehicles by reducing the registration fees or making ownership of electric vehicles less expensive. And that's not listed as a strategy here at all. I think, in fact, there may be, arguments going in the other direction for ensuring adequate funding for VTrans and towns by increasing the cost of electric vehicle ownership. I just wonder whether you looked at the pros and cons of those strategies at all.
Yeah, it's on the electric vehicle incentives. Because we're already assuming such an aggressive baseline from the rule, the Advanced Clean Cars rule, we didn't assume that there would be an additional benefit of incentives. That said, I mean, we clearly heard from the stakeholder outreach, and we believe that though there will be incentives needed to make that rule achievable. And so we actually do, we do have some cost estimates in here, I think, at some point, but, it was a little bit tricky to, we couldn't like explicitly kind of model that as, a separate strategy that would have additional benefits, just because, again, we thought that the existing rules are so aggressive already, it's not going to go beyond that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, back to Joey and then Jared.
Okay, I'll try to be quick, and thank you for your patience with my questions, just trying to gain as much knowledge and really understand. On the fee baits, here it shows closing in by 2050, 2.8%. And the draft plan, you showed it by 2030, closing by 4.4%, I think. Just clarifying again, this is revenue neutral fee bait. And then in the sort of slide where you talked about fee baits, you noted one of the considerations as sort of being a zero-sum game. I'm just curious, just if you can confirm that what you modeled or thought is a revenue neutral, if you can explain what you mean by zero-sum game, because that seems like progress, 4.4% by 2030. And if it could be different if it was nominally not revenue neutral, meaning if there was. So I'm just curious, those sort of three things related to fee baits. Thanks, Chris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, we assumed it would be set up as a revenue neutral policy where the kind of the fees and the rebates are balanced. we don't have a lot of good evidence to work from in terms of effectiveness. Basically, we've got a couple of studies from European programs that were adopted, 10 to 15 years ago, but nothing from the United States or North America. So, we just applied, it's a fairly simple analysis, just applying an elasticity effect. I guess, in the sense of, helping it be an additional incentive for electric or zero emission vehicles, would sort of go into that bucket. As you get out towards 2050 again, things get more and more uncertain. So, I'm not sure it would put too much stock in that line item specifically for 2050.
I think also the way that we had modeled it was just specifically applying it to the fuel economy of the non-electric, just like the gas and powered cars and trucks. And again, using the limited data that we had from Europe, where I think it said that it had helped improve fuel economy by about 6% for those new sales. And I think we even just factored that down a little bit just to be conservative and just said, what would that happen if it helped nudge fuel economy for any future gas powered starting from the year of implementation. So that's kind of the limited parameters we had to model it. Just wanted to make that clarification. That it wasn't expanding even more electric vehicles from the fee baits. It was really just seeing if we could help improve the fuel economy of the new passenger stock that was still going to be sort of part of the sales in the next 10 years.
And if we're not revenue neutral, I think it's more an issue of like, how big is the fee versus the rebate and that difference, as opposed to, is it revenue neutral or not? I guess if it were revenue positive, you could reinvest that money elsewhere. If it were revenue negative, like if you were just giving rebates, then you'd obviously need a funding source. So, but revenue neutral seemed like the safest assumption, just in terms of, the program design. So
well, yeah, which is also, thank you, Chris, that's what we'd recommended in the climate action plan. So I just wanted to verify. So that totally makes sense. But just in terms of zero sum game, just wanting clarity around what you mean by that.
Well, maybe not the best terminology, but that was
okay.
Just in terms of on the consumer side, some people pay more, some people pay less.
Jared?
So just one additional clarification on this. Can you say whether when you modeled the fee baits, it was just on new vehicles or whether it was new and used vehicles?
The effect that we were looking at is just on new vehicles, just based on those European programs. I haven't seen any data on a program that would apply to used vehicles, so just don't have a good sense. That would be a little bit complicated because the vehicles are already out there. The question is, how would it sort of ripple through the used vehicle market and then influence new vehicles and how they get pulled into the market? So I think it'd be complicated to try to estimate that.
Agreed. The last thing I want to say on this is actually to go back to a question that Rich brought up and that you then spoke to, Chris, which is, I think we've talked about some ways in which the modeling is conservative. I think you described the fee bait modeling as there were assumptions made that made it more conservative. I think it's important to pause and really appreciate that there are ways in which the modeling, especially the business as usual modeling, was very optimistic. And I think a key way that's true is the assumption, correct me if I'm wrong, ANR team or Andrea or Chris, is that every zero emissions vehicle that would be delivered to Vermont as a result of the Advanced Clean Cars rule and potentially the other rules would be placed in service when throughout we have made the very important point that depends, that assumption coming true depends on continued and additional investment in infrastructure and incentives to enable that scale and pace of uptake, which doesn't necessarily just happen on its own. So I just wanted to note that there are ways in which the modeling can be either more conservative or more optimistic. And I certainly hope that every single zero emissions vehicle that gets delivered to Vermont as a part of those rules ends up in service. But I don't think we can assume that that will be the case just the way things stand now or business as usual.
That's right. And that's why we made the recommendations about supporting transition to zero emission, even though we didn't explicitly model that as a line item.
TJ?
So I feel like I'm being really dense here in this conversation. Transportation is not really my primary area here, but I'm still confused as to, so we have a cap in place that says we will get these, we won't emit more than X, but I'm struggling to, and that meets our proportional share of the requirements or wherever we set it. But I'm still struggling to understand what the on the ground kind of practical measures are that happen above and beyond kind of advanced clean cars or whatever that actually allow us to meet that target. And I think maybe that's where I'm missing. And my question before was like, well, are there enough measures even to get us to that? Or are we just relying on the cap and the price drivers to behavior change to drive that change? Because in this instance, like what's striking me in the conversation today, or what I keep thinking is, is a cap itself really assurance that we're going to meet the targets? And I don't know, the cap is the cap, but what do we do physically to actually get us there? Or do we have a cap and then we just blow past that cap and there's exemptions and allowances or whatever? And so I don't even know if I didn't phrase that in the form of a question, but if folks could kind of enlighten me on that, I think that, and it can be later on too. I don't know if we're running out of time here, or should know as a co-chair, but.
Thanks, TJ. Let me first ask our guests to take a stab at that question, and then members of the transportation working group.
Well, I'll say, you're absolutely right. It's a great question, and there need to be mechanisms that cap plays out. And on some of it could be on the industry side in terms of developing lower carbon fuels. Some of it is going to be on the consumer side in terms of responding to price effects, whether that's driving a little bit less or deciding they're going to purchase a more fuel efficient vehicle or an electric vehicle. There's still going to be kind of supporting actions and programs to help people do that. But no, you're absolutely right. There's a whole bunch of mechanisms and that needs to play out with. And if industries and consumers actions don't get us to where the cap is, then the price goes up. And at some point you probably hit a price cap because, you have to set a reality limit on these things. And if that happens, then maybe you don't actually achieve your reduction. So those are all the kind of the considerations that New York has been working through on their program design in terms of, how do you set caps and safety valves and all the other mechanisms to help make those achievable.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else want to chime in on this one, Gina?
Well, I just want to say that Megan O'Toole is our in-house expert on this. Now, I hate to put you on the spot, Megan, but I would look to her because she's been involved in what's going on in New York and knows through various multi-state initiatives what's going on with Cap and Invest. And I apologize for putting you on the spot, Megan, but we do have someone here in Vermont state government who knows, can answer that question.
Wow, Gina, I'm really flattered that
you Sorry, but you're the girl on this one.
Well, yeah, and I have to say that you know, ANR, as folks know, we do participate as the administrator with our friends at the PUC of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is another cap and invest program. And so we have expertise in administering these types of programs to that extent. And Brian's on the line as well, as you know, who is our program lead for RGGI. So I think that we can speak from experience of understanding the successes of RGGI and also the struggles that RGGI has had, you know, earlier on in its program design and implementation. So, you know, I think that's helpful, but yeah, I don't know that I want to offer any specific comments in relation to this question. I think that there's a lot of questions that remain in terms of understanding how a policy like this could benefit Vermont, and to the extent of like when we could realize those benefits. So I'm gonna leave it at that, but I think there's obviously a lot of other questions that could be answered at some point in the future that could help inform a more robust discussion about this, within the context of the GWSA or just within the context of acting in general to mitigate. So I'll leave it at that, but thanks, Gina. I'm very flattered.
Thank you. It's all about how the program's designed, and that's what we need to figure out next.
Yeah, and I think we know, and you know, Brian and I are representing ANR right now in the RGGI program review, which is, you know, the periodic you know, hard look at the RGGI program that the states go through every few years, and it's, you know, the modeling effort that is required in answering questions about program design of a cap and invest program and its effectiveness and the goals that you want to achieve is it's a really significant effort, right? It's a very detailed and sophisticated modeling effort that sets different program parameters and design points, and we see modeling results based on those very specific questions. So, you know, there's a lot more detailed analysis that can happen to answer these types of questions about effectiveness based on design and stringency.
Thank you.
Okay, Megan, Jared.
Thanks, Rich. I would just offer, I think TJ's question is a really fair one, in that, you know, if we know that the kind of presumed maximum amount of zero emissions vehicles are already going to be delivered to Vermont as a result of the rules, then, you know, what additional on the ground activity would a cap and invest program require? And I think it's, or enable. And, you know, I think it's a really fair point. The analysis for the initial climate action plan, I think the analysis in this report really does show vehicle electrification as the primary, you know, highest impact way to reduce the transportation sector emissions. But I would note that there are, I think, still things to be uncovered that a market-based cap and invest program could help uncover and drive further reductions. We see that all the time when we have the power of a market-based program trying to uncover value, leading to innovative strategies that do not yet exist. One of the really uncovered ways that is not just about replacing new, otherwise would be internal combustion engine vehicles with zero emissions vehicles is the existing fleets operating more efficiently or using cleaner fuels. So, you know, there are a lot of medium and heavy duty vehicles, leaving aside the advanced clean trucks rules or the advanced clean fleet rules that are going to look at the composition of the fleet in terms of future new vehicles. What can we do with the existing vehicles in terms of cleaner fuels? This has happened significantly out in Oregon with biodiesel replacing, which is biodiesels, let me be very clear, that are lower emitting on a life cycle basis, replacing diesel fuels. You know, I think so. To me, the value of a market-based program is providing the incentive to uncover economic value and use the dynamism and efficiency of the market to uncover things that otherwise wouldn't happen to reduce emissions and help people move towards more affordable transportation options. So I think it's a fair question, but I also think that we shouldn't necessarily assume that we can't get additional reductions beyond the kind of most high profile opportunities.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Further conversation, further questions? We do have that one recommendation from Bram that our task group take a look at everything we've talked about today and come back with a recommendation. Anything further? Okay. Thank you all for a solid discussion of a complicated issue.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, we just have a few minutes left in our meeting to just hear a couple of quick updates. Jared, are you and Colin teed up here?
Sure, I've been talking a lot though, so I defer to Colin to give the update unless he really wants me to.
Please go for it, Jared.
Okay, so we had a cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting yesterday.
I mean, data and science.
Yes, sorry, thank you. Oh my goodness. We had a science and data subcommittee meeting yesterday where we were lucky to be joined by our friend David Plum from CBI, who many of you know from facilitating Climate Council and steering committee meetings. And he was there to help us facilitate a work planning process for the Science and Data Subcommittee in support of the Council's work planning process as we work backwards from our requirement to write and submit a revised climate action plan by July of 2025. So a lot of that discussion looked at the analysis that has been done before to support the initial cap, ongoing analysis, and potential newly needed analysis or updated or revised analysis to support the cap revision process. And a lot of that focuses because that's been a big part of what the Science and Data Subcommittee, not alone, many other subcommittees of the council, including this one, have also been involved in helping review, provide comment on some of the key analysis and research that has underpinned the climate action plan. But that was a big focus of ours. It was really meeting one of two, and we're planning to have a second work planning meeting. And once we have some draft documents to share, we would love to share them with this subcommittee for comment and feedback. And I imagine there will be many areas of kind of overlapping interest and kind of collaboration between the subcommittees as we look at the new updated or revised analysis that will be needed over the next year, so that we can all feel confident in developing and knowing where we're at and what's needed with regard to the many different obligations of the Solutions Act when it comes to submitting a revised climate action plan.
Questions for Jared? Did I hear you, maybe I just missed it, did I hear you say something about the schedule for this ongoing review and when we'll hear back from that?
I mean, I think that there's multiple pieces of analysis that are on different timelines. There's still some outstanding studies that members of the Science and Data Subcommittee are part of task groups to help with the review process on, including the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions report, including I know Colin has been involved with an agriculture sector related study on trying to further refine and get more accurate numbers, both on a gross and a net basis with regard to ag sector emissions. But, you know, we talked about, for instance, the fundamental foundational importance of the pathways analysis that underpinned the existing cap, and the importance of updating that as it relates to the revised cap. And, you know, it feels like right now we're in this kind of in between, a little bit confusing space, because we're hearing about updates to the business as usual projections, some that have been done by consultants working on the thermal sector analysis, EFG and SEI, some that have been done on the transportation sector analysis for the carbon reduction strategy, as we've heard today from Chris and his team. But we have not yet seen kind of an overall economy-wide, statewide update on the BAU, and I think we'll need to have that and feel like we have confidence around how that was arrived at, and be able to kick the tires on the assumptions and inputs to support the next cap revision.
Okay, thank you. Anything further on that? And for in the interim, in the short term, we also have the thermal analysis, that's thermal sector analysis that's ongoing. And we're not ready to have a presentation on the content of that. That's still underway, but I thought the committee should know where it stands and how soon we might be receiving that, or when it might be done, available for review. TJ, can you speak to that?
Sure. So you all will recall several months ago that there was an update to this committee, I think probably mostly focused on the business as usual update, but work has been ongoing on the analysis of the impact of various policy options to the proportional share of the 2030 and 2030 GWSA targets, and then also looking at a scenario of 2035. So that analysis has been ongoing. Energy Futures Group provided the state team with a draft report a few weeks ago, and we had provided comments, and we also have shared that draft report with the buildings task group, so several of the folks here on this call. And we just received those comments back, most of them, I believe, this week, Tuesday. I think we got some back, and we'll be sharing kind of a consolidated set of comments with EFG within the week, and then expecting a final report with revisions in November. I'm going to turn to Brian or Jane for the exact dates, because I don't call those off the top of my head, but it is coming soon. Brian, maybe you have the exact dates, or want to fill in all of the various blanks that I have left in that summary.
No, that was good. That was good, man. Yeah, we have the report under review. Jared was just talking about an updated baseline. This report updates the baseline in the buildings sector and also in transportation, because they relate to each other. So you'll be seeing that, and that's going to be a really helpful deliverable. It does show that we still need additional reductions to meet that 2030 target. We're going to examine some scenarios for policies in the buildings thermal sector that I won't go into detail on, but we're expecting the final report and a report back to this group for the week of November 13th. I think the next cross-sector meeting is November 16th, and we will be inviting the contractor to present their findings at that time to this group, plus whoever else shows up.
Thanks, Brian. Anything further for the committee today? Any public comments on the second half of this meeting? TJ?
Sorry, just before public comment, I feel like I should share that, the Public Service Department has done a lot of work on the electric sector. We don't talk about the electric sector a whole lot here. But really in buildings and transportation, we're talking about moving a whole lot to the electric sector, and what our future path is with our renewable energy standard has been the subject of, I think around 18 months now of a public process that we've been leading. There are certain results of that out. We have a draft technical analysis on different scenarios that a stakeholder selected or stakeholder nominated, department selected stakeholder advisory group has helped us with. We have statewide polling and focus group results that there'll be a webinar on November 8th if folks are interested. Hit me up for that information, but you can find everything on our website and publicservice.vermont.gov/renewables. Everything's there, but I'm happy to also share that directly with the committee when there's, I don't know if there'll be time with the thermal task or thermal report next meeting, but it could be a topic for December meeting as well. So I kind of want to share, there's a lot going on. Please let me know if you want any more details on the electric supply work that we're doing.
TJ, thanks very much. I have to say that talking about electricity is something that always makes me happy. So, and I know it's important to everything else we're talking about as well. Look forward to that. Just pausing for a moment to see if there are any members of the public who'd like to address the committee. And seeing none, I believe, oh, Jared, you have a final comment?
Yeah, I might just provide one update. I actually don't know. It's the same update I provided yesterday in Science and Data. I don't know if it has been shared publicly yet, so I will refrain from naming everyone. But the Senate Committee on Committees made appointments or reappointments for the 7 Committee on Committees members of the Climate Council on Friday to new 3-year terms. I think for this subcommittee, the primary folks that relates to is that means that myself and Peter Sterling, who also serves on this subcommittee, will continue on the Climate Council for another 3-year term. There were 5 other folks, including some new folks appointed, and we'll have to sort out as a council with those new councilors kind of which subcommittees they want to serve on. But I just thought I would provide that timely update that the Senate appointments for the second terms of 7 climate councilors have been made.
Thanks, Jared. And there's a note in the chat that Jane will circulate those names. Thanks, Jane. Bram?
Related to what TJ said about the PSD's work on electric generation, not specifically related to this subcommittee, but I do expect that the biomass writing group will have a revised recommendation probably to circulate to the entire council prior to our December meeting for debate and vote at that meeting.
Thank you. Any other final announcements? Okay, then I think we're concluded. I want to thank the committee members and our guests for substantive conversation, really important topics and some real challenges in front of us. But Chris and Ben, your report was excellent. Really helpful to see those numbers. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thanks.